Welcome to the Three Sports Podcast. I am Ben Axelrod. Joining me as always is Craig Lindell from Waiting for Next Year. Craig, we have typically been a Cleveland Browns podcast, I think. I think if you had to classify us as any sort of podcast, we started this thing in the middle of, really at the start of Brown season. So we knew we were going to at least start in that direction, but I think we always had the intent of winding up being a Cleveland sports podcast. And I think we're at that point. Even though the Senior Bowl is going on, even though everybody has scorching takes on Josh Allen and Baker Mayfield and whether or not Saquon Barkley is worthy of the number 4 pick or the number 1 pick or Kirk Cousins, I am all Brownsed out. Like, I have no Browns take. I am so numb to the Senior Bowl coverage and Baker Mayfield giving good answers on Bull and Fox. Like, I am just like, I'm at the point now where I don't have any Browns feelings left, and I'm ready to talk some Indians and Cavs.
No, I'm excited too. It's a lot of waiting and watching. In the old days of blogging and stuff like that, we always felt like we had to cover the waterfront at all times. But now it's like, I've been listening to the podcasts that Zach Jackson and Dustin Fox and those guys have been doing from the Senior Bowl, and it's cool.
Yeah.
But I feel like, well, they're doing it. I'm not there, so
right.
I can't do it. And it's just a waiting game. Like, do I prefer Alex Smith or this person? It's like, I don't know if either one is available, so I don't really care about talking about it. Generically, I want the Browns to do something at quarterback. And other than that, I got to wait and see what happens.
Right. We've kind of classified ourselves, I think, as quarterback agnostic. Like, we don't have...
Fix it.
Right. Fix it. Fix it. Throw out a more competent product on September 12th.
And I'm not saying there's only one way to fix it, but fix it.
Right. No, I'm with you.
So I'm excited to talk about the Cavaliers, even though I'm not excited about the Cavaliers.
Well, do you want to start? Should we start with the Cavs? Because let's start with the Cavs because they're the hot story, and that will probably be the meat of this podcast. We've talked about the Cavs briefly before. Like,
sure.
We used to talk about the Browns, then we'd say, what are your Cavs thoughts? And we'd basically say, we don't have any Cavs thoughts because it's November or it's December.
Yeah.
It's hard not to have an opinion of this team right now. And I used to be a guy, really, for the first 3 years of the LeBron James return, because this has happened every January. Or I shouldn't say this because I don't think this has happened every January, but some sort of dip in the production of the Cavs, some sort of dip in the roller coaster that is having, that's what I was looking for. A dip in the roller coaster that is having LeBron James on your team has happened every January since he came back in 2014. And I was always the guy saying, let it be.
Here's the real question, though, because I didn't pay attention. Did it happen in Miami?
It happened the first year in Miami. Actually, the first year in Miami was a lot like the first year in Cleveland, where they got off to the rocky start and then they hit their stride later in the season. It took the Cavs a little longer, I think, because they made that trade for J.R. Smith
and Mozgov
and Amon Shumpert, and that was pretty much, completely shifted that team. It didn't happen as dramatically in Miami. In the third year in Miami, they went on the long winning streak, I think. So it was a little it didn't happen like that in Miami. But with Cleveland, it was a different roster. You had Kyrie coming into his own a little. I always thought it was the David Blatt firing in 2016. It was always understandable, I thought, why these dips in the roller coaster came. And I was always the person saying, this is the NBA regular season. Not every team is going to be the Warriors. The Cavs still have the best team in the Eastern Conference. Don't come to the parade if you're complaining right now. And this January is not like this. There are real problems on this roster. There are real problems with this team. And even for somebody who tries to be as optimistic with a LeBron James roster as I try to be, I can't do it right now.
It's one of those things that in sports, when you've been through the cycle a few times, and both of us have with different teams and different stars, even different teams that weren't in Cleveland, there's almost no such thing as a happy ending. The closest thing to a happy ending in sports that we've seen is maybe Peyton Manning, and even that one, like, he was glued together on a team that was not the one that people associate him with.
Yeah.
And you just have to wonder if this is we thought we had our unhappy ending with LeBron. We ended up with kind of a happy ending. But even with the championship in 2016, is this the real kind of bittersweet ending that we deserve, or that we had to happen? Not deserve, but had to happen. I mean, it's kind of the natural evolution of every team having an endpoint.
Well, I think that's interesting, because even if LeBron James left this summer and the franchise was in shambles, regardless of what they did with the Brooklyn pick. I mean, once LeBron leaves,
it will be in shambles.
Right. Once LeBron leaves, I've always said this, it sets off a bomb inside your franchise. Because,
and at 34 years of age, it's not really even an indictment of him.
No. I almost feel like this point was inevitable, although I think it was made a lot worse. Actually, it wasn't inevitable, because the Kyrie Irving trade now is beginning to look like just one of the all-time disasters.
Is it just revisionist history that, well, the Cavaliers didn't have to trade him? Because,
yeah.
I mean, I kind of suggested as much and wondered aloud as much, but I don't know anything. And now the drumbeat is getting louder and louder of people kind of coming back around and saying, well, they had him under contract for 2 years. They could have just said no.
It's tough. It certainly. See, there are a lot more people saying that now than were saying it in July and August, and maybe that's because the emotions were raw. Whether it was because Kyrie requested the trade or because the Snapchat videos where he was mocking LeBron. It's tough to say, because we don't know what goes on behind closed doors. Like, we don't know what Kyrie Irving said to Dan Gilbert when he made his intentions clear he wanted to be traded. We don't know enough. For as much as we do know about the LeBron-Kyrie dynamic, we don't know enough to say whether or not that would have been tenable to bring him back. Just from an NBA standpoint, though, it's beginning to look silly that they traded him for what they traded him for. And I think the problem there's a couple of problems with this, and it's one, that month where the Cavs didn't have a general manager, which is, Brian Windhorst has said it on multiple platforms. It's going to go down as one of the most damaging periods in Cavs history, because you look at all the movement that went down with Paul George going to Oklahoma City. You look at Kyrie wanting the trade and how the Cavs handled that. For all of that, they didn't have a general manager in place. And even if they had Kobe Altman as the acting GM, he does not have enough experience to give you that confidence that he could have handled it as well as David Griffin could have.
And this is something I talked about on another podcast recently. It's not even pointing fingers at Kobe Altman. He might be a great general manager, but the transition of power, the awkward, period where Dan Gilbert was basically running personnel and signing Jose Calderon.
And publicly flirting with Chauncey Billups. Right. That's the thing. Kobe Altman was never the first.
About Chauncey Billups.
Kobe Altman, and that went on for a month. I remember tweeting every Thursday of each month saying, it's now been 1 week since the Cavs have employed a general manager. It's now been 2 weeks. It got up to more than a month, I think, until they finally. By the time they promoted Kobe Altman, I was already living in Cleveland. So it took almost 2 months for that transition to happen. That's just normal functioning franchises don't do that.
And not only were they without a GM, they were without the GM who read the room and decided to fire David Blatt, who, you can say that anybody could have made these trades, but whether it's perception or reality, he was a guy who was also kind of psychologist to the Cavaliers, or at least he kept his finger on the pulse of the psychology of the team and seemed to really be in tune with that.
Well, I think there are two ways you can go with that too, because Kyrie being traded is going to go down as such a milestone in this franchise and such a direction-altering occurrence, because
has to.
You look at it, and I mean, we can have this conversation later. What's the basketball argument for LeBron James returning to the Cavs? And it used to be playing alongside Kyrie Irving, because Kyrie was such a natural guy to pass the baton to. And really, you look at the way LeBron is starting to look a little sluggish and the way Kyrie's playing out in Boston. Like, this was probably the season where that transition of power was going to begin to happen. And I know you have to factor in Kyrie's personality and all of that. But you mentioned David Griffin reading the room. I think, one, if there was anybody who could have persuaded Kyrie to change his mind, it was probably David Griffin. And two, it seems like David Griffin did read the room, and he saw that this was coming, and that's why he was trying to trade Kyrie Irving on his way out, and that's why there was a deal
for Bledsoe.
Well, I just wrote about it. It wasn't in place. It seemed to fall apart on Phoenix's end, but there was a deal where they were going to acquire Paul George and Eric Bledsoe, and that's reportedly what LeBron's upset about not happening. And some of that, too, is because Dan Gilbert didn't want to acquire Paul George on a one-year rental without a commitment from LeBron James. So that's another discussion. But you're right. It is revisionist history to say that they did not they did not need to trade Kyrie Irving because David Griffin was trying to do it on his way out. But it's very clear that getting the return that they got, and also I think trying to hedge with it with that Brooklyn pick, that's beginning to look like a really big mistake.
Yes. Well, and this is something that you and I did talk about and have talked about, is the stark reality of the fact that you cannot win a trade where you are giving away the best player.
Right.
No way, shape, or form. It's the old sentiment that 4 quarters don't equal $1 when it comes to NBA trades. And the Cavaliers are sitting here with 4 quarters, and it's not worth the same dollar that's playing in Boston now. That's just a fact.
Well, with the way Jay Crowder and Isaiah Thomas has played, it hasn't even been. And with the way the Brooklyn pick has declined in value, or at least it's been up and down throughout the year, it's not even 4 quarters. I mean, it's not. It's really been just. It's been the worst case scenario for the Cavs right now, I think, the way this is all played out.
But so if you were to rank the Cavaliers' problems right now, would you put chemistry as a bigger problem than like actual roster talent? Because I think the biggest problem going on with this team right now is leadership and chemistry, and not so much the collection of talent. Yeah, JR's struggling. And he's just flat out not playing well. Mm-hmm. But I think most of the Cavaliers' problems right now is leadership and chemistry.
They almost go hand in hand, because it seems like a lot of the struggles are as much personal. Like, it seems like whatever's going on in that locker room, and clearly it's not good. Is flooding over into the court. From a roster standpoint, this team should obviously be playing better. This should be one of the 3 best teams in the Eastern Conference during the regular season. This should be the favorite to win the Eastern Conference in the playoffs. And they're not playing at that level right now, but I think from a talent standpoint, they have that potential. There are still glaring holes, I think, on the roster. They clearly need a real center. They clearly, if JR is not going to play better, they clearly need a wing player. I should say if neither J.R. Smith or Jay Crowder are going to play better, they need another wing player. There are holes on this roster. The gap between themselves and Golden State is widening, and that's not even a discussion worth having at this point. No. It feels like with the problems this team has. My question is, like, how bad does this thing get? Because Brian Windhorst has been mentioning this on his radio and podcast appearances. They're like 4 losses away from the 8 seed and fighting for their playoff spot. And can you imagine that if we're going into the end of February and March and we're wondering? It would almost come full circle to those first 2 years with LeBron when he was a rookie and a second-year player, where all we wanted was them to make the playoffs, and it came down to the last day of the regular season. Something's going to happen between now and February 8th, the trade deadline. I would imagine they're going to trade for George Hill. It sounds like they're not going to trade for Paul George. They're not going to trade for DeMarcus Cousins.
Is it even worth trading for George Hill? I mean, is that a kind of addition by subtraction? If you're making that trade and you're not removing Jay Crowder or Isaiah Thomas, what are you actually accomplishing if those guys are the ones who are after Kevin Love in the private meeting? And this is something else that I talked about recently on another podcast, is the Woj bomb is back in Cleveland.
It wasn't there prior.
I don't know, but I know it's Isaiah Thomas.
Well, if you're going to do a docuseries where documenting your comeback, maybe you leave out the scene of you on the phone with Woj. like giving him a scoop back in September about your health. Maybe just don't let people know that you have that Woj is your preferred.
So what you're saying is we don't know, but we know it's Isaiah Thomas.
Well,
are you going to hedge?
Like if this was
don't hedge, Ben. You know.
Well, the only other issue is Cavs management and Dan Gilbert have a track record of talking to Woj too. Like when LeBron came back, Dan Gilbert gave Woj his firsthand account of how it all went down.
That's true. So
there is a track record of Dan Gilbert doing that. The only thing is Isaiah Thomas has a motive for leaking that meeting. Dan Gilbert certainly does not. So that's usually what you look at. If you're trying to decipher who the anonymous source is, usually it's whoever has the most to gain. And I think Isaiah Thomas, who's fighting for a max contract, has a lot to gain by making Kevin Love look like the scapegoat. It's annoying. It's frustrating. It's bizarre that the Cavs, I know there's a lot of drama throughout the NBA, but the Cavs are always in this state of drama until they get to the playoffs, and then Lil Kev comes out. But then again, you've traded Richard Jefferson. You're getting ready, it seems like, to trade Channing Frye, who I think actually has a place in this rotation. I think that's been one of the faults of Tyrone Lue, is taking Channing Frye out of the rotation.
I agree.
Because the spacing he provides, and I think Kyle Korver's a lot better when Channing Frye's out there.
That unit that had Channing Frye and Kyle Korver, and it feels really dumb to even talk about rotation type stuff with all the stuff that's going on in the behind the scenes meetings and locker room squabbles and whatever else. But from a pure basketball standpoint, that rotation that lineup that included Korver and Channing Frye together was really, really deadly.
Yeah,
it gave the Cavaliers a distinct advantage when LeBron went to the bench, because they would expand leads or get leads.
Mm-hmm. Well, and when LeBron's on the floor, LeBron surrounded by four shooters is as close as you're going to come to unstoppable outside of the Warriors. Because the Warriors formula is pretty much LeBron plus four shooters.
You either have to clear out the inside, or you have to give a very high percentage 3-point shot.
I mean, even when Kyrie was in Cleveland, that was consistently their best lineup. So I don't. Yeah, I mean, it's fun because like now Ty Lue's on the hot seat, quote unquote,
which is ridiculous.
It's just like I just don't have a Ty Lue take. It's like, should they fire him? Probably not. Could they? Probably. But that's far from the biggest problem with this team right now, is the head coach.
Yeah, of all the solutions, quote unquote solutions, it doesn't feel like one.
I've been a LeBron defender pretty strongly since he came back. And I'm still of the opinion that he owes nothing to the Cavs in terms of giving them a commitment. Because what if he doesn't want to stay? Why should he give them a false commitment? I think it's silly for Dan Gilbert to be hedging his bets with LeBron leaving, as if having that Brooklyn pick is going to somehow make next summer any easier. And if it does, because it winds up being the number 1 pick or the number 2 pick in a pretty loaded draft, that's just blind luck, and that could have happened a year from now in the lottery. Whatever happens if LeBron leaves, next year is going to be a quote-unquote tank, so I don't really care how many lottery picks they're in the hole. I will say the leadership thing is interesting, because this continuously happens in what is supposed to be his locker room. And every time he's left a franchise, he's kind of left it in a blaze.
Yeah, because in that last year, he's Mr. Leadership guy when he gets there. And he talks about leadership and strive for greatness and all this stuff. And then when he gets on the precipice of his contract being up, he's kind of like, well, throw my hands in the air, show me something. Mm-hmm. But meanwhile, and I'm with you, I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth. LeBron owes nobody anything.
Yeah.
He can do whatever he wants. It's free agency, as we know all too well. At the same time, when you're LeBron James, you are the most powerful human in sports history, potentially.
Yeah.
Let alone the NBA. You are the power broker. You are the Nike guy. He is the market maker.
Right.
And so for him to sit back
You go back to 2014, he waited a week to make his decision, I think, to come back to Cleveland once free agency opened. Yeah. The entire market froze. I've never seen anything like it.
Yes.
In 2014.
But he's the market maker. And you look at Houston, and without James Harden actively talking to Chris Paul doesn't come there. Mm-hmm. And without LeBron James actively working here, Kevin Love never comes here to begin with. Mm-hmm. And so LeBron James gets all the credit for building the roster. And then when he's towards the end of his contract, he throws his hands in the air and he says, well, look, it's not my job.
Right.
You prove it to me. But he is the key component in any equation because he's the greatest, the best, the most influential, the most powerful. And so for him to throw his hands up, it's his right, but it's silly.
Well, I think the flip side of that is I think he, for all intents and purposes, recruited Paul George to Cleveland last summer. And the question, I think this goes back to, this kind of brings us full circle. You said, was this point inevitable? And I think to a degree, this point was inevitable because LeBron James and Dan Gilbert are never going to trust each other.
Yes.
And so LeBron can recruit Paul George. And you look at Paul George, he's making comments now about how Russell Westbrook is making his free agency decision easier because of how much he enjoys being there in Oklahoma City. There's no reason that couldn't be Cleveland. Paul George was even saying nice things about the fans in the queue, and I know a lot of that's just player speak, but it's not unfathomable to think that Paul George would have enjoyed his time in Cleveland, would have re-upped here, would have made all the sense in the world for LeBron and him to stay here with Kevin Love or whatever they would trade Kevin Love for.
And they already played that game with Kevin Love.
Right.
Kevin Love didn't have to stay here either.
Right. And so, but I don't think it seems like Dan Gilbert did not trust, for whatever reason, LeBron James enough to push harder for a Paul George trade.
And it's a horrible miscalculation because now
it's terrible.
He's looking at George Hill.
Right.
Get out of here with George Hill. I don't even know. I don't play fantasy basketball, so I don't know who George Hill is.
Right.
I know who he is, but ask me to describe his best move. I can't tell you.
George Hill's a run-of-the-mill combo guard who was traded for Kawhi Leonard on draft day, and nobody really knows if he's good or if he's bad. He's one of the, Jeff Teague.
And he's 32.
Right. And he has $19 million left on his deal for next year. So it's I think they thought with that Brooklyn pick, I think they thought there would be a market at the trade deadline, whether it was Paul George or DeMarcus Cousins, and there's no trade market for it. And that's, DeAndre Jordan is now the tipping point. Do you trade the Brooklyn pick for DeAndre Jordan or not?
I'd rather kiss my sister than trade for DeAndre Jordan at this point.
I think it would be disappointing at this point if they didn't try to do something to get better. And so because I'm not attached to the Brooklyn pick, I'd be fine with it. I'd probably support it. I'm not going to cry about not acquiring DeAndre Jordan, but
well, I agree that LeBron's last year is not the time to leave bullets in the gun.
Right.
But at the same time, if you miss your shooting window,
right,
and the Cavaliers seems like they missed their shooting window, maybe it is time to leave the bullets in the gun. And save that Brooklyn pick. I would have said, no way do you save that Brooklyn pick 3, 4, 5 months ago.
Right.
But now that it feels like they've really missed the boat time and again, starting all the way back to when they were without a GM, maybe it is time to save those bullets. I
think that's why I say DeAndre Jordan's the tipping point, because I think DeMarcus Cousins and Paul George, guys like that, are no-brainers. Even though they're both guys with 1 year left, this is they're in their final seasons of their contract. No-brainers. You go all in and you acquire Boogie or you acquire Paul George. Those are no-brainers. DeAndre Jordan, that's one of those. DeAndre Jordan's also in the last year of his contract, and he makes your team better, but he doesn't make you good enough to beat the Warriors. So what's the point?
No, and so that makes me question the market for Isaiah Thomas.
Right.
There's somebody out there who wants a chance to have Isaiah audition, or they want to audition for Isaiah Thomas and have some time with him to get it. They wouldn't have a chance on the open market as much as they would if they got 4 months or 3 months, whatever it is.
Somebody wants
to give him $22 million.
Somebody wants to overpay Isaiah Thomas, and whoever has him has the best chance to do that.
The Cavaliers need to find that team, and find something of value for that, because it seems like they need to get him out of here.
It is still a very much star-driven league. What we are dealing with now, even as bad as it is, I think they've lost 11 of 15, maybe 10 of 13. It's really bad. these are still first world NBA problems.
They are.
Do you trade your lottery pick for an all NBA player, or do you like, these are, and obviously it's all magnified by the potential bomb that could be set off next summer with LeBron, but the Cavs are, one of 4 teams in the league, I'd say, but Golden State, Houston, San Antonio, I guess Boston now, who would be dealing with an issue like this. But there are teams like Charlotte, there are teams like Orlando, like Phoenix, like Dallas even, like getting an Isaiah Thomas would be Denver, getting a player like Isaiah Thomas who has name recognition.
Even Indiana. Who's like a fringe playoff team.
Right. Yeah, there's a market for Isaiah Thomas. I think the Cavs should do it. I think they've been exploring it. I don't know how actively they have been, but it seems like ever since they acquired him, and this is probably because of the hip, the Cavs have been very careful not to over-promote Isaiah Thomas. So they came out with those gray jerseys that they're going to be wearing next weekend, and they only came out with them in LeBron and Kevin Love. There's no Isaiah Thomas one available for sale yet. I read into stuff like that because I've seen it happen. And I think...
I'm trying to remember which Indians bobblehead night occurred after the player had already
It was
been
Victor
traded.
Martinez.
Yeah.
It was Victor. Yeah, it's... I remember one of the big... when they drafted Andrew Wiggins, they were kind of wishy-washy about when the press conference would be, and then they came out with his jersey, and they had a big sale like the next week on NBA jerseys on the Cavs Team Shop website, and they were all 50% off, including Andrew Wiggins. And I was like, this is weird. This is a guy they just took first overall. Usually these are full price for a full year. And lo and behold, they trade him a month later, and they actually issued a you can either keep your Andrew Wiggins jersey or trade it in for a LeBron or Kevin Love jersey. So I read into stuff like that. I just think they've been very hesitant, probably because of the injury, to over-promote a guy who they didn't know when he was going to play. But I think flipping Isaiah Thomas, I think it's always been a potential option. And now with the way this last month has unfolded, it feels like a very real option and something they should definitely explore.
Yes. One, I think they are. And this team is not going to look like this by the time...
I hope it looks more different than just Amon Shumpert being swapped out with George Hill. That would be very disappointing.
Shumpert and Fry for George Hill is not going to do anything for me.
The good news is, for people advocating changes with this roster, Dan Gilbert is probably the most trade-happy owner in the NBA, especially around the trade deadline. Like, when was, I guess last trade deadline was pretty boring, but when was the last time the Cavs have not been active at the trade deadline?
It's like some of my greatest Cavaliers memories when they got Delonte and Ben Wallace and Wally Zerbiak.
Out of nowhere.
And Mozgov and Shumpert and JR.
Well, so it probably really started LeBron's second year, I think, was the Yeri Welsh trade. Yeah, Dan Gilbert would have just bought the team, I think, at that point. They trade the future first rounder for Yeri Welsh in 08.
Because he was a three-point shooter.
Yes.
Yeri Welsh.
LeBron and shooters.
Three-point threat.
08, because it was my freshman year of college, and it was right before Twitter had taken off. I used to watch ESPN trade shows. Like, they used to do the NBA special. And
when you couldn't get the information on your ESPN Insider account.
Right, yeah. Yeah. And I was probably on some scout message board or something. And 5 minutes after the trade deadline, they announced this blockbuster trade between the Cavs and Bulls where the two teams basically swapped out rosters. Like, the Cavs took on Ben Wallace for Larry Hughes, and they got Wally Zerbiak and Delonte, and they swapped out half their. I think
those guys came from Minnesota, right?
Seattle.
Seattle, okay.
It was a three-way deal with Chicago and Seattle.
That's right.
And then the following 2 years were probably the most.
The Cavs just traded Larry Hughes, or were there some other pieces, parts? I'm trying to remember.
Donyell Marshall, probably.
Yes.
Maybe Damon Jones has an expiring contract.
It's interesting.
Eric Snow probably.
But I just remember the game before those guys were active. They were up in a luxury box, and the Cavaliers had like 7 rostered players or something for that game that night.
Yeah, I remember they debuted on a Sunday afternoon game against Memphis. That's what I remember.
Yeah.
So excited for Ben Wallace. Then
And he was really a positive addition to the Cavaliers.
He was. He started for a while. The next year, then, that was the most interesting.
Was that the Shaq year?
The next year was they almost acquired Shaq.
Almost acquired.
2009, and there were rumors about Amari Stoudemire.
By the way, while we're on this topic, I was listening to the podcast of the Ken Carman Show featuring Anthony Lima, and they had Chris Mannix from Sports Illustrated on. And he was talking about how Cavaliers need to be willing to trade the Brooklyn pick, and it's reminiscent of that time that the Cavaliers refused to trade J.J. Hickson for Amari Stoudemire. That's not true. That never happened. The Cavaliers would have parted ways with J.J. Hickson. The trade was pulled off the table by Phoenix. It's one of the great misconceptions. It should be on Snopes.
Well, that gets to these next two, 09 and 10. LeBron's final 2 years in Cleveland the first time around. So 09, there were big rumblings about Amari Stoudemire. I remember heading into the All-Star weekend, and the Cavs were, it was this whole thing on the Real Cavs fans message board. It's called the Amari Safari, where it was this huge, probably 1,000-page thread of people thinking the Cavs were about to acquire Amari Stoudemire. And it fell apart. And it would come out later that that's what happened is the Suns pulled the deal. And then it got into, I think the Cavs had Wally Zerbiak's big expiring contract to trade. And then it got into a discussion for Shaq, which fell through, but they wound up acquiring him after the season, after they lost to Orlando. Well, so the following year,
because they needed to match Dwight Howard's
they needed
dominance.
to defend Dwight Howard with Shaq, with 40-year-old Shaq. The following year, in 2010, the Amari thing was real. Like Amari was going into his free agency, and so the Cavs were making a run at Amari. Well, they were worried. This is like message board lore, so I don't know. I'm not reporting anything. This is just message board lore. Though the Cavs were reportedly so scared of Phoenix pulling a deal again that they panicked and made the Antoine Jamison deal. And so that's it was Amari or Jamison they were going to wind up with. They wound up with Antoine Jamison, obviously. The rest is history. But yeah, it's never. And then LeBron's first year around, it wasn't quite the trade deadline, but they get JR and Shump and Mozgov.
Trade deadline memory lane is really fun today.
And even in 2016, trading Andy Varejao out and getting Channing Frye back. Dan Gilbert has been super active. He's not afraid to make a ballsy deal. So I'd be paying attention to Isaiah Thomas right about now.
Getting Kyle Korver is nuts too.
Yeah, that was in January of last year. So they're going to do something. And I think it's going to be more than George Hill, but it
just feels like if they start with George Hill, they might have wasted an opportunity elsewhere.
Right. Well, there's going to have to be a corresponding deal because then Tristan would be the only playable big man on the roster.
Pretty much.
Are you just from a fan's perspective, it's been such a weird year because you want to savor LeBron's potential final year here, and this has been they're so not fun to watch. And LeBron's not even having those dominant performances. And he clearly needs 2 weeks off or something. And I don't know if they can afford to give him 2 weeks off. And that used to be at least doable because you had Kyrie. It's not fun basketball to watch. Right? And I know we're gonna be kicking ourselves a year from now saying, remember when we were complaining about watching LeBron, but...
No, we need the All-Star break.
Mm-hmm.
We need to hit the reset button a little bit. They probably need to make a trade. But no, I mean, I've kind of tuned out. I keep it on in the background while I'm doing something else now.
Yeah.
I don't actively watch Cavaliers games right now. I passively watch them.
Yeah. It's tough.
It's brutal.
Yeah. Well.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Jim Thome.
Let's talk about Jim Thome.
He got elected to the Hall of Fame yesterday. He's going to go in as a Cleveland Indian. It's one of those weird. It's a little weird in the sense that, he spent half his career in Cleveland. I think he's most remembered as a Cleveland Indian. And just because he spent the first half of it there, and then it seemed like the second half hopping from team to team, I don't know. It doesn't feel like a complete Cleveland Indian I mean, it's not a complete Cleveland Indian legacy.
It's one of the things I like least about baseball is how a team like the Indians never gets the Derek Jeter storyline. It's not possible. You can't have a player, a Hall of Fame caliber, with the Cleveland Indians who spends 100% of his entire career with the Cleveland Indians. And that's either something you're willing to accept and get used to, or like me, you get a little bit salty when they start building statues for guys who left for more money. And it's not totally Jim Thome's fault.
No.
The market size, the market dynamics, the Dolans, et cetera, it's not his fault that he got offered a lot more money somewhere else and he decided to take it. But it's also not my fault as a fan that he spent half his career here, maybe the best half of his career here.
Yeah.
But I don't get to erase the fact that he left. And I don't care that he came back when he was 39 and 40 years old. I mean, it was kind
and then left again.
It was kind of fun, but it doesn't mean that much to me.
It was a good nostalgia act.
But I'm not here for nostalgia.
No.
You know, the What If campaign was fun for 5 minutes, and then it was just a icky kind of a curl my nose up marketing campaign. So I'm the wrong person to talk to. You know, it's fine. People love Jim Thome. People are happy he's in the Hall of Fame. People are happy he's in the Hall of Fame as a Cleveland Indian. I'm not here to steal anybody else's joy. I just don't personally share it.
I feel the same way, and I wish I disagreed with you because I think that would be a more fun conversation.
It would be.
Like, to me, I grew up on the 90s Indians, but I was also, I think I was so young at that point and naive that I didn't feel, I remember being very disappointed when Manny went to Boston and then when Thome left a year later. I remember feeling like, okay, this is over. But it didn't devastate me like the way LeBron leaving left. And maybe that's just, you know, that's a different thing. That's your team.
Manny was the closest, and then Victor Martinez was close.
See, that sucked, but that was also a trade. And so that was at least, I mean, like CeCe was a trade, but it was pretty much CeCe leaving for New York. Like you knew
that
you
one
were
didn't
gonna
make
lose
me
him.
sad.
That one bummed me out.
I understood that one.
Yeah. Oh, I did too. It's the realities of baseball. Is you could sign a guy to a Joe Mauer deal and cripple your payroll for the next. It's what's going to make the Francisco Lindor extension, if there is one, so fascinating. Is what does it do to the rest of the team? What does it look like? How many years is it for? Oh, I do not want to have that conversation.
No, but at the same time, I feel like I'm the only one. I know there's some risk, and you have to have some risk tolerance when you sign these guys to these deals, but the idea that somebody's not tradable is ridiculous. I know the Indians had to eat money on Nick Swisher's deal, but that was that was the worst possible scenario. If the Indians wanted to trade Edwin Encarnacion right now, they would get value back, and they wouldn't have to cover even $1 of his contract. Right. If they had signed Jim Thome to the same thing that the Phillies signed him to, and they decided they needed a rebuild, assuming his shoulder didn't fall off, and it didn't, they would have been able to trade that deal. And so the idea that, well, they're on the hook for $85 million. No, they could just partake in the first 3 years and then try and trade a guy just like anybody else.
Yeah. I think one of my frustrations with the Indians lately has been how reliant they've been on the 90s Indians as a promotional tool.
Yes.
And that's why you see Jim Thome get a statue before Larry Doby, which is utterly ridiculous. That's why...
It also felt like a bit of an admission of guilt that they didn't pay him to begin with back when he left.
And that's why you see Jim Thome throwing out the first pitch at every playoff game they had. And they're so reliant on the 90s Indians, and I get it because it's a effective marketing tool. But you have such a great collection of talent now that it almost seems like they're saying, "Hey, look over here," and that's always annoyed me. And it's always annoyed me, I guess, that Jim Thome, and maybe this is just a blind spot for me, that Jim Thome is the player they're always using to promote the 90s Indians, where when I think, and I know it's tough because Omar's on a coaching staff somewhere and Manny is...
They keep Carlos Baerga around.
They do, yeah, they'll bring him out for signings.
Kenny Lofton a little bit.
Every once in a while, Kenny.
They even get Albert Bell back a little bit.
Well,
but yeah, you're right. It's Thome first. Everybody else is a distant second, third, fourth.
And that's I've seen a lot of people use Thome's Hall of Fame selection to celebrate the 90s Indians, and that's fine. I mean, celebrate this and process it however you want. For me, it will be Omar. If Omar ever gets elected, which it seems like it's one of those things. I guess people thought 37% yesterday was promising, and that maybe down the line he'll get in because of that. I
think it's a bad thing because there are some historic shortstops on their way.
Well, that was the 90s, though. That was. Well, how many of them are left, though? You got Jeter.
Garciaparra fell off, so he's not going to make the Hall of Fame. But for a minute there, it was A-Rod, Jeter, Garciaparra.
It was so hard for Omar to make All-Star games. Yeah. It was pretty impressive that he did, given how crowded the AL was. But yeah, it's going to be. It's cool he got in. I was actually a little surprised, and again, maybe this is just me being more of a casual baseball fan. I never thought Jim Thome first ballot Hall of Famer. And I think the first ballot, second ballot thing is silly. But I guess I'm not good with the numbers and all of that. And it's just always silly that we have these arbitrary marks. Well, 600 home runs, he has to be in the Hall of Fame.
Well, and if the Hall of Fame committee was willing to vote for guys who were convicted of steroid use or whatever, Jim Thome might not have been a first ballot Hall of Famer.
That's true.
The field got reduced greatly, especially because Joe Morgan wrote a letter to every single voter this year that nobody should vote for anybody who was guilty of steroids. And so when you're artificially reducing the field of players who were his peers, who compiled the same stats and the same box scores, regardless of asterisks, all those people are gone. So now Jim Thome really stands out.
That's why it's hard for me to even really get too fired up about the Hall of Fame.
But is Jim Thome better than Sammy Sosa?
No. Mark McGwire? I mean, that's...
Barry Bonds?
No,
He's more like Rafael Palmeiro.
Yeah.
A slightly better version of Rafael Palmeiro, probably.
Yeah, it's just so hard for me.
But he's the only Bonds we have because the real Bonds is not allowed in.
Right. It's hard for me to get fired up about the Hall of Fame or any of that stuff just because the 90s, the late 90s was my peak as a baseball fan. 98 was like my favorite year in baseball history, and it was artificially enhanced, and none of those guys are going to get in. And so it's like all the players to me who are the most famous players, they're not going to be in the Hall of Fame. So
Manny Ramirez was my favorite Indian growing up.
Me too.
And of course, I hated when he went to Boston, but he's never getting in the Hall of Fame.
No.
Roger Clemens is never getting in the Hall of Fame. The interesting one, and I heard this on the radio, so it's somebody else's point. The interesting one is David Ortiz.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was just going to say is there are guys who maybe they weren't in the the Wells report or the Mitchell report. There are guys who weren't, who never tested positive, who were never in these reports, who were never in the Jose Canseco book, but who there were whispers about, who there were questions about. I mean, who got in last year?
When David Ortiz served a suspension.
Did he?
I believe.
I think he was named in one of those New York Times articles where he tested positive before testing mattered. I don't think he ever served a suspension.
Okay.
I might be wrong. But Ortiz is interesting because I think he was in the New York Times article about guys who tested positive before testing, when they did their trial testing or whatever, before they actually implemented their plan. And that's supposed to remain anonymous, and they did not remain anonymous. But so how do you handle that? How do you apply your arbitrary judgment to it?
When honestly, I've never been to the Hall of Fame. I don't really care that much about the Hall of Fame. I don't care that much about baseball as an institution.
No.
I
actually rail against it at this point.
I'm just an Indians fan. Mm-hmm. I like Cleveland baseball.
Yeah.
And I like the Cleveland baseball heroes. I hope that as I say frequently, Francisco Lindor should never play a game of baseball for any team other than the Cleveland Indians.
Yeah.
And everybody knows it. So that's all I root for.
Yep. I think we can leave it there. That's about as much Hall of Fame talk as I can muster. That's going to do it.
If only we had something to fight
Yeah.
No, you're wrong.
I'll get some draft takes going here soon, I'm sure. Maybe if it starts to, I guess my one draft take is I don't want Baker Mayfield, so we can get into it about that at some point. But that's going to do it for today's 3 Sports Podcast. He's Craig Lindell from Waiting for Next Year. I'm Ben Axelrod from WKYC. If you enjoyed the show, subscribe on iTunes, leave a rating, leave a review, tell a friend. We'll be back with you next week, breaking down all the latest in Cleveland sports. Thanks for listening, guys.